The day of the auction was overcast, the sky heavy with a dull gray that seemed to mirror the despair of those gathered below. A small crowd had formed, a mix of opportunists, curious onlookers, and those who treated the event as a twisted form of entertainment. At the center of the chaos stood a wooden platform elevated just enough for the people below to inspect the goods on display. But the woman they were about to bid on was no object yet. In the eyes of this merciless crowd, she was reduced to one. Barely recovered from childbirth, still weak and bleeding, she was propped on the edge of the platform, her body trembling from pain, exhaustion, and fear. Her mind was a storm of confusion. Just days ago, she had been in the relative safety of her home, or what had once been home only, to be thrust into this nightmare. Now, surrounded by strangers who whispered cruelly among themselves, she felt the full weight of her vulnerability. Each step the auctioneer took, each word he spat into the microphone, seemed to chip away at her already fragile sense of self. The crowd's voices rose and fell like waves of judgment crashing over her. Some sneered, making comments about her condition. Others debated her worth as if she were livestock. The humiliation pressed down on her chest, and she could barely breathe. Her newborn rested swaddled in her arms, its tiny cries adding to the cacophony of the scene. But also a source of fierce determination. She could not let harm come to this fragile life she had brought into the world. At the edge of the crowd, a lone figure observed the scene with an intensity that set him apart from the others. The rancher was a man of quiet strength, his rugged features carved by years of solitude and hard labor. He had seen cruelty before, the way the world could crush the weak and vulnerable, and something in him flared at the sight of this woman, bleeding and broken, yet still alive with the faint pulse of defiance. He did not move immediately to intervene. Instead, he watched, noting her subtle reactions, the way she tried to steady herself despite the pain, the tiny, almost imperceptible glances she gave the crowd as if measuring their intentions. In those moments he saw something others did not, a spark of resilience, a quiet refusal to be entirely defeated. The auctioneer's voice rang out sharp and relentless. "Do I hear $50? $50 for the lady." The crowd murmured and adjusted their stances, anticipating the next bid. She shrank inward, instinctively pulling her child closer, as if proximity could shield them both. Every offer made was a reminder of her lack of control, of the powerlessness imposed on her by a society that saw women like her as commodities. Anger, fear, and despair twisted inside her. She wanted to speak, to protest, to demand recognition of her humanity, but the strength simply wasn't there yet. Her voice caught in her throat, swallowed by pain and exhaustion. The rancher, however, remained resolute. He recognized that the real value of a person could never be measured in money. His decision was made quietly, internally, without seeking approval or attention. This woman deserved protection, and he would be the one to provide it. As the auctioneer's hammer hovered, ready to finalize the sale to the highest bidder, the rancher stepped forward, a calm, deliberate motion that made the crowd pause. He bid, and the murmurs grew into whispers of surprise and curiosity. He was not interested in her as an object. He sought to rescue her from the degradation, to provide her and her child with a chance at life beyond this auction block. In that moment, the crowd's voices faded in significance. All that remained was the fragile, terrified woman on the platform, the newborn in her arms, and the quiet determination of the man who had seen the spark of life that others ignored. The first chapter of her redemption had begun, not with a flourish, but with a simple act of recognition, of seeing her as more than broken, more than bleeding, more than an object to be bought and sold. The murmurs of surprise rippled through the crowd as the rancher's bid rang out. It was clear to everyone that he had no interest in flaunting wealth or asserting dominance. This was not a game to him. Yet, in a world where cruelty and indifference often overshadowed compassion, even his quiet action caused a stir. The auctioneer paused, blinking in disbelief. "Do I hear more?" he asked, but the air had already shifted. The spectators, accustomed to calculating profit from misery, found themselves suddenly unsure of how to react. Whispers spread. Why would he do this? Who buys a woman not for gain, but seemingly out of concern? On the platform, the woman's mind raced, a storm of conflicting emotions. Confusion first, then suspicion, then a glimmer of hope she hadn't allowed herself to feel in days. This stranger had just bought her, not for wealth, not for amusement, but seemingly for her safety. She didn't trust him yet. How could she? She had been betrayed by those who should have protected her, left vulnerable to the very world now laughing at her pain. Her arms tightened instinctively around her newborn, whose soft cries punctuated the tension. The reality was overwhelming. She was no longer merely a victim of circumstance. Her life, however uncertain, had been placed into someone else's hands, someone who claimed he cared. The rancher moved forward with deliberate calm, his gait steady, unhurried. He extended a hand not in command, but in invitation. "Come with me," he said simply. There was no fanfare, no speech of grand intentions, just a quiet assertion of agency on her behalf. She hesitated, gripping the infant closer, her body still trembling from exhaustion and pain. Yet there was something in his eyes, a depth of honesty, a promise unspoken but palpable, that urged her to step down. Slowly, carefully, she allowed herself to be guided away from the platform, away from the harsh gaze of the crowd. The whispers of curiosity followed them, but the distant murmur seemed irrelevant. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, she experienced a fragment of safety as they moved through the throng. The rancher's presence was reassuring, though not overwhelming. He did not talk unnecessarily, nor did he make her feel small or fragile. Instead, his quiet confidence provided a shield, a protective barrier between her and the cruelty that had surrounded her just moments ago. With each step toward his waiting horse and wagon, the woman's tension eased, replaced gradually by cautious trust. She observed him, noting the careful way he adjusted the baby in her arms to prevent discomfort, the slight furrow in his brow as he scanned the crowd for potential threats. This man, who had just purchased her from the auction block, seemed determined to treat her not as an object, but as a human being deserving of care. In that silent procession, the weight of her ordeal began to sink in. The auction, the cruelty, the physical pain, these had been defining her life for days. But now, in the rancher's calm presence, there was a subtle shift. She began to imagine, cautiously, what life beyond the auction block might look like. Perhaps there could be healing. Perhaps there could be a chance to regain dignity. And most importantly, perhaps her child could grow up in a place free from exploitation and cruelty. The crowd slowly dispersed behind them. Some bewildered, some quietly resentful, but none of it mattered. In the space between the platform and the horizon, the woman and her child walked beside a man whose actions defied the brutal logic of the world they had known. This simple act of purchase, an act of protection and recognition, marked the beginning of a fragile yet profound bond. In that moment she realized something powerful. She had been seen. Not as property, not as a victim, but as a person alive and deserving of care. The first step toward recovery, toward life beyond suffering, had begun. The journey from the auction site to the ranch was long, dusty, and silent in the way that only new, uneasy bonds can be. The woman rode in the back of the rancher's wagon, cradling her newborn as she tried to ignore the soreness in her body and the persistent ache in her side. Each bump of the wagon wheels reminded her of the fragility of her condition, yet she was determined not to let fear overwhelm her. She was painfully aware that she had no control over what was happening. That the man beside her, the rancher, was the one holding the reins, both literally and figuratively, of their journey. The rancher drove with steady hands, eyes alert to the landscape ahead, the horizon stretching wide and unbroken. His presence was calm, not overbearing, but commanding enough to make her feel a strange, tentative sense of safety. He didn't speak much at first, allowing silence to fill the space between them. The woman, weary and exhausted, appreciated this. Words felt unnecessary when every step of her body seemed to protest against the strain of the day. Yet, in the quiet, small observations began to arise. She noticed the firmness of his hands, calloused but gentle, the steady rhythm of his breathing, the way he adjusted the reins with deliberate care. These little details told her that this man was someone used to responsibility, to life lived on effort and integrity. Not cruelty. As the wagon rumbled along the dusty trail, she allowed herself to glance around. The world outside the auction block seemed impossibly vast. Rolling fields, distant hills, and clusters of trees painted a landscape that was foreign yet strangely comforting. For the first time in what felt like forever, she felt removed from the harshness of human judgment. Here, the world seemed governed by natural laws, not by the whims of a heartless crowd. She exhaled slowly, letting a fraction of tension leave her body. The rancher finally spoke, breaking the silence in a voice low and even. "We'll be at the ranch soon," he said. His tone was matter-of-fact, devoid of sentimentality, yet there was a subtle undertone of reassurance. He didn't offer empty promises or pity. He simply stated the truth. There was a place waiting where they could find shelter, safety, and a measure of peace. She absorbed his words cautiously, unsure how to respond. Trust was fragile, and she had learned that people often betrayed those who depended on them most. Yet something in the straightforwardness of his tone suggested sincerity. As the miles passed, small exchanges began to unfold between them. She asked questions about the land, about the animals, about the daily life of a rancher, her curiosity peeking through the fog of fatigue and pain. He answered simply, without embellishment, but with subtle warmth. These conversations were tiny bridges, spanning the gap between two people who had begun as strangers and were slowly navigating the delicate territory of mutual understanding. She realized that, despite her physical weakness, there was strength in this dialogue, in asserting herself even in small ways. The newborn, quiet for a moment, began to stir, and she instinctively soothed the child, her maternal instincts sharp despite exhaustion. The rancher glanced over and offered a small nod of approval, a gesture that conveyed respect rather than intrusion. For the first time in days, she felt recognized not only as a mother, but as a person capable of caring for her child. The rhythm of the wagon, the steady presence beside her, and the open landscape ahead all combined to create a fragile cocoon of safety and possibility. By the time the ranch house came into view, silhouetted against the fading light, she felt a cautious optimism stirring. The journey had been more than physical, it had been emotional and psychological. She had begun to sense that this man, the rancher who had bought her from the auction block, might represent something radically different from the cruelty and neglect she had known. Perhaps, she thought quietly, she was not entirely alone in the world. Perhaps there could be a place for her and her child to begin again. The first steps toward recovery and trust had begun on this long, dusty road. The ranch was quiet, a stark contrast to the chaos and noise of the auction. Its wooden structures stood solid against the sprawling backdrop of fields and rolling hills, a place seemingly untouched by the cruelty of the outside world. As the woman stepped down from the wagon, her legs unsteady and sore, she was struck by the simplicity and order of it all. For the first time in days, she felt a glimmer of relief, a small, fragile hope that perhaps she and her child could find safety here. The rancher guided her gently into the main house. Inside, the air smelled faintly of wood smoke and clean linen. He had already prepared a small room for her and the baby, modest but warm and welcoming. She sank onto the bed, exhaustion threatening to pull her under. But the sight of her child resting safely beside her brought a surge of protective instinct. Despite the ache in her body and the lingering pain from childbirth, she felt a tentative sense of comfort, something she hadn't experienced in weeks. The rancher moved with quiet efficiency, tending to her immediate needs. He brought a basin of warm water, carefully cleaned her wounds, and offered simple, nourishing food. His actions were deliberate and steady, neither overbearing nor condescending. There was no pity in his eyes, only a pragmatic concern for her well-being. This simple recognition of her humanity was more powerful than any words. She noticed, with cautious appreciation, the way he adjusted the blanket around her and the baby, ensuring both of them were comfortable and safe. For a woman who had just been treated as property, these gestures were profound. As the hours passed, she began to feel the physical effects of care and rest. The warmth of the fire, the gentle rhythm of the rancher moving about the house, and the soft cooing of her baby created a fragile sense of stability. She could feel her strength returning, bit by bit. Yet more than physical healing, something deeper began to stir. For the first time, she considered that perhaps there were people in the world capable of genuine kindness. She had been crushed by cruelty for so long that the idea almost seemed foreign. And yet, the rancher's quiet presence suggested that trust, while fragile, could be rebuilt. She observed him as he worked feeding the animals, mending fences, checking supplies. His movements were practiced and efficient, yet there was an unspoken care in the way he approached the ranch, as if every action was a commitment to maintaining the life he had built. She realized that, like her, he carried burdens and scars, though of a different kind. This recognition sparked a quiet empathy within her. They were both survivors in their own ways, each navigating a world that demanded resilience and fortitude. Over the next few days, small routines began to form. The woman learned the rhythms of the ranch, the care required for animals, the simple but essential tasks that kept the household running. She discovered that she had strength she had forgotten, a resilience born of necessity and instinct. The rancher, in turn, began to recognize her intelligence and capability, not just her vulnerability. Mutual respect began to grow in subtle ways, an understanding that she was more than the circumstances that had brought her to the auction block, and that he was more than a silent provider. Amid this healing, the bond between them began to take root. It was not yet love. Too many walls still stood, but there was trust, fragile yet undeniable. In the quiet moments when the fire crackled and the baby slept, they would share small conversations, tentative smiles, and unspoken acknowledgments of each other's presence. The woman began to believe, cautiously, that she could survive this ordeal, and that perhaps there was a future in which she could thrive rather than merely exist. By the end of this chapter in her life, healing had begun in earnest. Her body was slowly mending, but more importantly, her spirit was beginning to lift from the shadows of fear and despair. The rancher's simple acts of care had sown the first seeds of hope, setting the stage for a journey toward trust, resilience, and eventually the possibility of love. In this sanctuary, far from the auction block and the cruelty of the world, she had found the first measure of safety and the fragile promise of a new beginning. Just as the woman began to settle into a fragile routine at the ranch, remnants of her past crept back into her life, threatening the peace she had only just begun to feel. Word traveled fast in the nearby town, and those responsible for her being auctioned relatives, opportunists, or unscrupulous acquaintances had not forgotten her. They saw her survival and relative freedom as an affront, a challenge to the control they had once wielded over her. One morning, their presence became unmistakably clear. A group of men arrived at the edge of the ranch property, demanding that she be returned or that the rancher pay them compensation. Their voices were loud, full of arrogance and entitlement, and the threat in their eyes reminded her of the helplessness she had experienced on the auction block. Fear surged through her, but it was tempered now by a quiet, simmering determination. She no longer faced the world entirely alone. The rancher, standing beside her with an unwavering gaze, represented something she had never known: protection without expectation, safety without manipulation. He stepped forward to confront the intruders, his voice low but firm, carrying authority honed from years of working the land and dealing with conflicts that required more grit than brute strength. "She stays," he said simply. "And if you come any closer, you'll answer to me." His calm but unyielding tone left no room for negotiation, and the intruders faltered, uncertain whether to test the resolve of a man who exuded both power and righteousness. The encounter forced the woman to confront her own trauma. Memories of the auction, of betrayal, of being reduced to an object for others' gain resurfaced vividly. Yet this time the context had changed. She was no longer entirely at the mercy of strangers. She could observe, analyze, and even act in concert with someone she trusted. The rancher's presence did not erase her fear, but it created a buffer, a shield that allowed her to feel capable of facing what had once been insurmountable. In this protective cocoon, she realized that courage was not the absence of fear, but the ability to act despite it. Throughout the confrontation, the rancher did not speak of vengeance or punishment, but of boundaries and justice. He reminded her silently and effectively that the past did not have to dictate the present. As the intruders eventually backed away, realizing the futility of their threats, she felt a small but powerful sense of triumph. They had attempted to reclaim control, but it was denied not through luck, but through deliberate courage and the solidarity between her and the rancher. In the days that followed, the woman reflected on the experience. It had been terrifying, yes, but it had also revealed something crucial. She was capable of facing the remnants of her past without being consumed by them. Her strength was no longer invisible, and she had an ally who recognized and respected that strength. The rancher did not diminish her experience. He supported her, empowering her to reclaim a sense of agency she had long been denied. This confrontation also deepened the bond between them. Shared adversity had a way of forging trust more effectively than comfort alone. The woman began to see that the rancher's protection was not about ownership or obligation. It was rooted in respect and genuine care. She realized that survival was no longer about hiding or fleeing. It was about standing firm, reclaiming dignity, and asserting her place in the world, even in the face of those who sought to diminish her. By confronting her past on the ranch, the woman crossed a pivotal threshold. She was no longer merely a victim of circumstance. The auction, the threats, the cruelty, they were still part of her story, but they no longer defined her entirely. With the rancher beside her, she began to understand that healing required courage, not just to recover from pain, but to face it head-on, to assert her worth, and to claim the life she had been denied. This chapter marked the emergence of resilience, the beginning of empowerment, and the quiet but undeniable stirrings of hope. With the immediate threats of her past behind her, the woman began the slow, painstaking work of rebuilding her life on the ranch. The initial days had been focused on recovery, physical healing, emotional steadiness, and regaining a sense of safety, but now the rhythm of daily life called for something deeper: purpose. The ranch, sprawling and alive with work, demanded attention, care, and persistence. It offered her not only a refuge, but also a chance to redefine herself beyond the labels of victim and survivor. She started with small tasks at first: feeding the chickens, gathering eggs, and helping with the simple chores that kept the household running. Her hands, once weak and trembling, grew steadier with each task. Each day she accomplished something tangible, a small but meaningful victory against the helplessness that had shadowed her life for so long. Even the baby, nestled in a sling on her chest or cradled in her arms, seemed to sense the growing stability around them. The tiny life she had protected through fear and uncertainty now became a symbol of her strength, a daily reminder that she was capable of nurturing and creating life in a world that had tried to strip her of both. The rancher observed her quietly at first, offering guidance only when necessary. He taught her the rhythms of the land, the ways of caring for animals, the seasons and cycles of crops, and the unspoken patterns that governed ranch life. His approach was patient and deliberate, giving her space to learn, to fail, and to try again. There was no condescension in his instruction, only respect for her intelligence and resilience. Slowly, she began to see herself not just as someone who had been rescued, but as a partner in the life of the ranch, capable of contributing in meaningful ways. As they worked side by side, the walls between them began to shift. Their conversations, initially functional and practical, started to touch on more personal matters. She spoke cautiously of her past, of the moments of fear and despair, while he shared fragments of his own life stories of solitude, loss, and the hard labor that had shaped him. Through these exchanges, they began to understand one another on a deeper level. Trust, once fragile and tentative, began to grow steadily. Nourished by mutual respect and shared labor, the ranch also offered moments of quiet joy. They watched sunsets paint the sky in brilliant hues, listened to the wind rustle through the fields, and occasionally laughed together over minor mishaps with animals or chores. These small moments were profound in their simplicity. For the woman, laughter and calm were no longer foreign concepts but lived experiences. For the rancher, seeing her regain her confidence and agency brought a sense of fulfillment he had not known he was missing. Through the act of building a life together, a subtle transformation occurred. She began to shed the weight of shame and helplessness that had clung to her since the auction. Each day of meaningful work, each small accomplishment, each shared conversation, reinforced the sense that she could shape her own destiny. The rancher's support provided a foundation, but the real strength came from within her, from the resilience she had always carried. Now allowed to flourish in a safe environment, the baby, thriving under her care, became a symbol of continuity and hope. Through the daily routines of feeding, bathing, and soothing, she discovered a profound sense of competence and purpose. Her identity expanded beyond survival. She was now a mother, a worker, a partner, and a human being reclaiming dignity one day at a time. By the end of this chapter, the woman had transformed her life from mere existence to meaningful engagement. She had carved out a space where safety, love, and respect coexisted, and where her contributions mattered. The ranch was no longer just a refuge, it was a living testament to her resilience. In these quiet, labor-filled days, the foundation was laid for deeper emotional connections and, eventually, love. She was no longer merely surviving. She was building a life worth living, and with it, the seeds of hope and joy began to bloom. The days on the ranch had settled into a rhythm of work, care, and quiet reflection. Yet beneath this calm, something subtle and profound began to shift. The woman, once consumed by fear, mistrust, and survival, now felt emotions she had long buried: gratitude, admiration, and most unexpectedly, the stirrings of love. The rancher, whose presence had always been steady and protective, began to occupy a deeper space in her heart, not merely as a savior, but as someone whose character, strength, and quiet kindness drew her in. It was not an instantaneous awakening. Love in this story grew slowly, nurtured by shared experiences and mutual recognition of vulnerability and resilience. One evening, as the sun dipped low over the fields, painting the sky with streaks of gold and amber, the woman and the rancher worked together to mend a broken fence. Their hands brushed over rough wood, and a glance exchanged was heavy with unspoken understanding. Neither spoke, yet the air between them pulsed with an awareness that went beyond words. She realized how deeply she trusted him, not only to protect her but to respect her, to see her as a full, complex human being. That trust, she understood, was the foundation of love. The bond deepened during quiet moments of intimacy, small and domestic rather than dramatic. The rancher would bring her warm meals, check on the baby with gentle attentiveness, or sit with her by the fire at night, speaking in low, steady tones about the land, the animals, or the simple pleasures of life. These acts, seemingly ordinary, carried immense weight. They were gestures of constancy and care, revealing a man capable of deep commitment. In turn, the woman began to reciprocate, offering her skills, her insight, and her emerging emotional openness. She shared stories, tentative laughter, and eventually, her own fears and dreams, things she had never dared to reveal before. The transition from trust to love was punctuated by moments that tested their connection. A sudden storm swept through the ranch, threatening livestock and tearing at fences. Together they worked tirelessly through the mud and wind, their hands and bodies working in tandem, relying on one another's strength and judgment. It was in these moments of adversity that the depth of their connection crystallized. They saw one another not as savior and rescued, but as partners, each capable, each strong, each human, navigating life's unpredictability. Side by side, her feelings grew with the realization that he had never treated her with pity or ownership. Unlike those who had sought to control or demean her in the past, he had bought her not to claim her, but to protect her, to give her space to heal and thrive. Love, she began to understand, could be born of respect, care, and shared survival. And she felt, quietly but unmistakably, that the rancher felt the same way. There was a softness in his gaze when he looked at her, a rare vulnerability he revealed only when he believed she was watching. It was a language of emotion neither needed to speak aloud to understand. Over time, these subtle exchanges and shared experiences blossomed into something undeniable. She found herself seeking his presence, missing him when he was away tending the land or the animals. Her thoughts turned to him with warmth rather than fear. When he smiled or offered a kind word, it sent a ripple of joy through her chest. Slowly, the walls she had built around her heart crumbled, replaced by trust, companionship, and the tentative embrace of love. By the end of this chapter, love had emerged not as a sudden, dramatic declaration, but as a quiet, persistent force. It was the culmination of trust, shared struggle, mutual respect, and recognition of each other's worth. The woman, once broken and fearful, now felt the beginnings of a life that included emotional connection, safety, and joy. The rancher, who had quietly guided her from the auction block to this place of healing, had become more than protector. He was a partner, a confidant, and, gradually, the man she could envision building a future with. In the stillness of the ranch, against the backdrop of golden fields and endless sky, love quietly took root, promising a brighter, shared future. The sun rose over the ranch, casting long golden beams across the fields and bathing the wooden fences and barns in warm light. It was a new day, but for the woman and her child, it felt like more than that. It was the culmination of a journey that had begun in despair, cruelty, and fear. The auction, the betrayal, the pain of childbirth, and the threats from her past had all left indelible marks on her soul. Yet here, surrounded by the wide-open land, the animals she tended, and the man who had seen her not as property but as a person, she felt a sense of peace she had never known. The journey to this point had been arduous, filled with physical healing, emotional struggle, and the slow rebuilding of trust. But finally, redemption and hope had begun to intertwine. Shaping the life she had been denied, the woman moved through the morning routine with quiet confidence. The baby rested in a sling across her chest, cooing softly, while she fed the chickens and collected eggs, her movements steady and assured. The rancher worked nearby, repairing fences and checking the water troughs, his presence constant yet unobtrusive. Together they had forged a rhythm of partnership built not on obligation or power, but on mutual respect, shared responsibility, and care. The air between them was calm, filled with the unspoken understanding that they had both survived hardship and emerged stronger on the other side. Redemption, she realized, was not about forgetting the past or erasing pain. It was about reclaiming life, dignity, and choice. She had been auctioned, broken, and threatened, yet she now stood as a woman capable of love, resilience, and purpose. Her child, once a symbol of vulnerability, had become a source of joy and strength. In caring for the baby, she had discovered a renewed sense of agency and identity. Each day, as she nurtured the child and contributed to life on the ranch, she felt her spirit regain solidity, a foundation that no cruelty could dismantle. The rancher's role in this redemption was profound but understated. He had provided safety, yes, but more importantly, he had treated her as an equal, respecting her choices, her intelligence, and her strength. His initial act of buying her had been the spark, but his consistent care, patience, and quiet encouragement had fanned the flame of her recovery. Over time, admiration had grown into love, and their partnership had become a sanctuary in itself, a place where two broken yet resilient souls could thrive together. Challenges still arose, storms that threatened crops, difficult tasks that tested patience and skill, but each obstacle was met not with fear, but with determination and collaboration. Through shared effort, the woman and the rancher strengthened their bond while reinforcing the reality that they could face adversity together. Every problem solved, every challenge overcome, became a testament to their resilience, both individually and collectively. By evening, as the sun sank behind distant hills, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink, the woman stood on the porch with the rancher and the child in her arms. She breathed deeply, absorbing the peace of the moment. Here was a life reclaimed from the cruelty of strangers, a life built on respect, love, and the quiet triumph of survival. She no longer felt the lingering shadows of fear that had defined her past. Instead, she felt hope, pure, unguarded, and bright. Redemption had come not as a sudden miracle, but as the accumulation of countless small acts, care, protection, courage, and trust. The auction block and its horrors existed in memory, but they no longer held power over her. She had reclaimed herself, her dignity, and her future. And in the rancher's steady presence, she recognized the promise of a life shared, one filled with love, purpose, and belonging. As night fell and stars emerged above the quiet fields, the woman allowed herself to smile fully for the first time in what felt like an eternity. The past, though painful, had led her here. Her journey had been one of suffering, healing, and growth. And now, in the sanctuary of the ranch, with a child to love and a man who had chosen to stand beside her, she finally embraced the enduring promise of hope. The story that had begun in despair now concluded with the quiet triumph of life reclaimed, love nurtured, and a future that stretched wide and bright before her.